There is a detail buried in the death scenes of the Bible that almost everyone reads straight past, and once it is pointed out, it is impossible to unsee. We think we know what last words are. We imagine them as goodbyes, a final soft sentence, a closing of the eyes, a farewell to the people standing around the bed. That is what the movies have trained us to expect, and that is what we quietly expect for ourselves. But that is not what the Bible records. Go back and read the actual deathbed scenes of Scripture, one after another, and a strange pattern rises off the page. The dying in the Bible almost never spoke about themselves. They did not summarize their accomplishments. They did not list their regrets. They did not even, in most cases, say goodbye. With their final breath, nearly every one of them did the same surprising thing. They turned toward the people they were leaving behind, and they blessed them. They handed something forward. A last word in the Bible is not an ending, it is a handoff. And before going further, one clarification because it matters. This is not about the 7 sentences Jesus spoke from the cross. Those have their own weight and their own story. This is about the others, the patriarchs, the prophets, the kings, the first martyr, the apostle in a Roman cell, the ordinary mortals who knew the end had come and chose, with the little breath they had left, what to spend it on. What they chose tells us something the rest of their lives could not, because how a person says goodbye reveals what they believed their whole life was actually for. So look closely at what the text preserves. Start with the oldest deathbed in the book. His name was Jacob, though God had renamed him Israel, and by the time he lay dying in Egypt, he was an old man who had spent his life grasping. He had grabbed his brother's heel coming out of the womb. He had grabbed his brother's birthright. He had grabbed a blessing by deceiving his blind father. His whole life had been a closed fist, and now that fist was finally opening because there was nothing left to take. Genesis records that he called his 12 sons to his bedside, and what he did next was not to recount his journeys or settle his estate. One by one, he laid words over each of them. Some of those words were hard. He did not flatter. He told Reuben the truth about his failure, and he named the violence of Simeon and Levi without softening it. But over Judah, he spoke a blessing that reached centuries past his own death, a promise that a ruler would come from that son's line. He was speaking into a future he would never live to see, over children whose whole lives would unfold after he was gone. And here is the detail to hold on to, because it comes back. Just before this, Scripture shows him blessing his 2 grandsons and crossing his arms to do it, laying his right hand on the younger boy's head against all custom. The old grasper, who had spent decades taking with his hands, ended his life giving with them. The same hands, a different purpose. Then the text says he drew his feet up into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. No summary, no goodbye, just hands laid forward onto heads that would carry his name into a world he would not enter. Which brings us to the son standing in that room, Joseph. Joseph had every reason to make his death about himself, sold into slavery by his own brothers, imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. He had clawed his way up to become the second most powerful man in Egypt, the one who saved the known world from famine. If anyone had earned the right to a deathbed speech about his own remarkable life, it was that man. Instead, Genesis gives us this. As he was dying, Joseph gathered his family and said that he was about to die, but that God would surely come to them and bring them up out of Egypt to the land promised to their fathers. And then he made them swear a strange oath. He made them promise to carry his bones up out of Egypt when that day came. Sit with how much faith is packed into that request. Joseph was the most established man in Egypt. He could have had the grandest tomb in the land. Instead, he refused to let his body settle there because Egypt was not home. And he believed God's promise so completely that he wanted his very bones carried to a land he knew he would not see in his lifetime. His last act was to attach himself physically to a future that belonged to God alone. And those bones did travel. Hold that, because the text is going to pay it off in a way most people never connect. Now move forward a few hundred years to the edge of the Promised Land, to the man who led an entire nation to its border and then was told he could not cross it. Moses. 40 years he had carried these people. He had stood between them and Pharaoh, between them and the sea, between them and their own rebellion, between them and the anger of God. And after all of it, because of one failure at a rock in the wilderness, he was told he would not be the one to bring them in. He would climb a mountain, see the land from a distance, and die there. Anyone would have been bitter. Anyone would have spent their final words on the unfairness of it. But read what the book of Deuteronomy actually preserves as the end of Moses. Before he climbs that mountain, he gathers the tribes and he blesses them, every one by name. He speaks over a people who were about to walk into a home he was forbidden to enter. He blessed the very inheritance he would not receive. There is no record of complaint. There is a record of blessing. But the blessing was not the only thing Moses handed forward. Just before it, the book of Deuteronomy records something easy to miss. God told Moses that the people would turn away after he was gone, and so he gave Moses an unusual final assignment. He told him to write down a song and to teach it to the entire nation, so that when the hard years came, the words would still be in their mouths. A song is hard to lose. It travels from parent to child without a scroll, surviving in memory long after the one who wrote it is dust. So Moses, in his last days, did not only bless the tribes, he planted words inside them on purpose, words designed to outlive him by generations, so that even when he was centuries gone, his voice would still be teaching their grandchildren. His last act was to make sure his words would keep speaking after his mouth was silenced. Then he climbs Mount Nebo alone. God shows him the whole land, every hill and valley he had walked toward for 40 years and would never set foot in. And there Moses dies, and the text says God himself buried him in a valley, and to this day no one knows the place of his grave. The greatest leader in the nation's history has no monument, no shrine, no tomb anyone can visit. His last recorded act was not to secure his own legacy. It was to bless the people who would inherit what he could not. That is the pattern tightening now. Watch it hold with the next man. Joshua took the staff from Moses and finished the work, leading the people into the land at last. And when he came to the end of his own long life, at 110 years old, he gathered the whole nation one final time. He could have demanded a loyalty oath to himself. He could have warned them not to forget the man who conquered the land. Instead, he stood before them and made it about a choice they would have to keep making long after he was dead. He told them to decide that day whom they would serve, and then he spoke the line that has been stitched into the walls of homes for 3,000 years. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Notice what that sentence really is. It is not a memory. It is a commitment that points forward, past his own grave, into the lives of his children and his children's children. He set up a large stone as a witness, and he told the people that the stone had heard every word so that it could testify against them if they ever turned away. He was building guardrails for a future he would not be alive to protect. Then Joshua died, and they buried him. And in that very same chapter, almost as a quiet aside, the text finally keeps a promise made 400 years earlier. It says that the bones of Joseph, which the Israelites had carried up out of Egypt, were buried at Shechem, in the ground that now belonged to his descendants. Think about what that means. A dying man in Egypt asked that his bones be carried home. His family swore it. They carried that coffin through the parting of a sea, through 40 years of wilderness, through war after war, never burying it because of one old man's faith in a promise. And now, in the same breath that the Bible records Joshua's death, Joseph finally comes to rest in the promised land. The handoff worked. The last word of a man dead for centuries was finally honored. That is what Scripture means when it shows the dying handing something forward. The thing they release does not stop moving when they die. It keeps going. There is one more leader to set beside Joshua before moving on, because his ending sharpens the pattern even further. Samuel was the prophet who anointed Israel's first two kings, the man whose voice had guided the nation since he was a boy, hearing God call his name in the dark. When the people demanded a king and his long years of leading them came to an end, he gathered the whole nation for his farewell address, and he began it in a way almost no leader would dare. He stood before the whole nation and asked them to testify against him. "Whose ox have I taken?" he asked. "Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed?" He laid his entire life open for inspection, daring anyone to accuse him of a single act of corruption. And the people answered that he had wronged no one. But notice what he did with that clean record. He did not use it to build a statue to himself. He used it as a platform to point them forward. Having proven he had never led them wrong, he charged them to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all their heart. And he warned them plainly that if they kept doing evil, both they and their king would be swept away. His integrity was not a trophy. It was a lever to push the nation toward God one last time. Even his spotless reputation he spent on their future rather than his own memory. His final gift as their leader was not advice. And this is the part that stops you cold if you have ever lain awake carrying guilt about someone you were supposed to be praying for. Samuel told them that, as for him, far be it from him to sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for them. He promised to keep interceding for a stubborn, disappointing people even after he had stepped aside. He handed them his prayers, forward into years he was now placing in a king's hands and God's. But the pattern is not only tender. The next deathbed is more honest than we are comfortable with. David, the shepherd who became king, the man after God's own heart, the one who wrote half the prayers humanity still prays. The book of 2 Samuel actually contains a section it introduces with the words, "These are the last words of David," and they are beautiful. He speaks of God as a rock, of a ruler who governs in the fear of God, being like the light of morning at sunrise. It is poetry from a man looking back over a whole life and seeing God's faithfulness running through all of it. But there is another deathbed scene in 1 Kings, and this one does not flatter him. As David is dying, he gives his son Solomon a charge. Part of it is noble. He tells the young king to be strong, to walk in God's ways, to keep the commandments. But then, in the same breath, David hands his son a list of old enemies and old scores, men he wanted dealt with after he was gone. Even the man after God's own heart did not have a perfectly clean death. His final instructions were a mixture of high faith and unfinished grudges. And the text does not hide this. It does not pretend David's last words were all gold, which is its own kind of comfort if you let it be. Because if you are lying awake, afraid that your ending will be a tangle of faith and failure, of things you got right and things you never resolved, you are in the company of the greatest king Israel ever had. Dying well in the Bible was never about being flawless at the end. It was about which direction you were facing. And even with the grudges, David spent his last strength pointing his son toward God and toward the throne that would one day carry the Messiah. He was still, on balance, handing the future forward. The prophets did the same, even from a sickbed. Elisha, who had done miracles for decades, lay dying of an illness, and the king of Israel came down and wept over him. Here was a man who knew his body was failing, who knew these were his final hours, and his last concern was not his own death at all. It was whether the nation he had served for 50 years would be safe once he was gone. Even now, dying, he was thinking past himself. Now watch this, because it is one of the strangest deathbed scenes in the Bible. Elisha did not use his final hours to receive comfort. He used them to give a battle plan. He told the king to take a bow and arrows, and to open the window facing the enemy's land, and to shoot. And as the arrow flew, the dying prophet called it the Lord's arrow of victory. Then he told the king to take the arrows and strike the ground with them. The king struck 3 times and stopped. And Elisha, with what little life he had left, was angry because he said the king should have struck 5 or 6 times and won total victory. But now the victory would only be partial. The man was prophesying triumph for his nation while his own body was shutting down. His last breath was spent not on his own death, but on his people's deliverance. He was firing arrows into a future he would not live to fight in. And then the strangest detail of all. The very next thing the text records is that Elisha died and was buried. And sometime later, when some men were burying another body and were interrupted by raiders, they threw the dead man hastily into Elisha's grave. And the moment that body touched the prophet's bones, the dead man came back to life and stood up on his feet. Even Elisha's bones were still handing life forward after he was gone. The pattern does not even stop at the grave. Now jump forward across the whole Old Testament into the early church to a death that was anything but peaceful. Stephen was a young man, one of the first leaders of the new church, and he was dragged outside the city to be executed by stoning. This was not a quiet bedside. This was a mob, picking up rocks, throwing them at a man until he died. There was no soft pillow, no gathered family, no time to compose a final speech. There was only violence and pain and the certainty of death in the next few minutes. And what did Stephen do with those minutes? The text says he looked up and saw heaven open, and then he prayed two things. First, he asked the Lord Jesus to receive his spirit. And second, as the stones were still striking him, he fell to his knees and cried out, asking God not to hold this sin against the people who were killing him. He used his dying breath to bless his own murderers. He handed forgiveness forward to the very men crushing the life out of him. There is one more detail in that scene that the text places almost carelessly, and it changes everything. It says the men who stoned him laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul, who approved of the killing. Saul. Remember that name. The pattern is about to do something no one watching that day could have imagined. Because that same Saul, the one guarding the coats while Stephen prayed for his killers, would be knocked to the ground by the risen Christ on a road and would become the Apostle Paul. The man who held the executioner's cloaks would become the most relentless missionary the world has ever known. And the prayer Stephen handed forward, that God would not hold this sin against them, was answered in the conversion of the very man standing in the crowd. The blessing of a dying martyr reached forward and caught the future apostle in its net. So it is fitting that the last deathbed in this list belongs to Paul himself. Years later, Paul sat in a Roman prison, an old man now, worn down by beatings and shipwrecks and years of carrying the gospel across the empire. He knew the execution order was coming, and from that cell he wrote a final letter to a young man named Timothy. A letter that reads in its closing lines exactly like last words. He wrote that he was already being poured out like a drink offering, that the time of his departure had come. And then he did not write about his suffering. He wrote the line that has carried dying believers ever since. He said he had fought the good fight, he had finished the race, he had kept the faith. And he immediately turned it outward, telling Timothy that there was a crown waiting, not only for him, but for all who longed for the Lord's appearing. Even his triumph he handed forward. Even his finish line he turned into a promise for the next runner. The man who once stood approving a murder, who held the coats of executioners, ended his life having fought the good fight and finished the race, passing the torch to a son in the faith. The arc from Stephen's grave to Paul's cell is one continuous handoff, a single blessing traveling across two deaths and one transformed life. So step back and look at the whole pattern at once. Across thousands of years, across patriarchs and prophets and kings and martyrs, the dying in the Bible kept doing the same thing. Jacob laid his hands forward. Joseph sent his bones forward. Moses blessed an inheritance forward. Joshua pointed a nation forward. Samuel handed his prayers forward. David, grudges and all, aimed his son forward. Elisha fired arrows of victory forward. Stephen sent forgiveness forward into the future of the man who would become Paul. And Paul handed the crown and the race forward to the next generation. Not one of them spent their final breath defending what they had built. Every one of them spent it on what was coming after they were gone. And that is not only ancient news, it is being confirmed in hospital rooms right now. Those who sit with the dying for a living, the hospice and palliative nurses who are present for hundreds of final conversations, report the same thing with remarkable consistency. At the end, almost no one talks about their career. No one asks for their awards or their bank balance. The dying talk about people. They ask for estranged children. They try to mend a decades-old break with a sibling. They reach with whatever strength is left toward the people they love and the things they never said. Strip away 3,000 years and a different language, and the modern deathbed is reaching in the exact same direction as Jacob's. Forward, toward people, toward what is handed on. Which leaves the question that has been sitting underneath this whole video, the one you may have been circling at 2 in the morning without putting words to it. You are afraid of how it ends. Maybe afraid of dying with things unsaid to someone you have drifted from. Afraid that your life will not add up to anything worth passing on. Afraid that once you are gone, you will simply be forgotten, your name fading off the calendar as the world keeps moving without you. Here is what the pattern says to that fear. The people in this video did not finish well because their lives were tidy. David's were not. Jacob's were not. They did not get perfect closure, and neither will you. Some words will go unsaid. That is the honest truth, and no video should promise otherwise. But finishing well was never about tying a neat bow on your own story. It was about which way you were facing at the end. It was about reaching forward instead of clutching backward, spending your last strength not on protecting what you accumulated, but on blessing the people who will outlive you. And if that feels impossibly far off, look again at who these people were before the end. Jacob was a liar and a cheat for most of his life. David was an adulterer who had a man killed. Paul stood and watched a good man die and approved of it. Not one of them earned a peaceful ending by being good enough. They simply arrived at the last room of their lives and chose in that room to turn outward. If they could turn at the very end, after lives far messier than yours, then the direction you are facing is not fixed yet either. You still have time to turn. And that is the strange freedom hidden in every one of these deathbeds. Your last word does not have to be a goodbye. It can be a handoff. The blessing you speak, the forgiveness you finally extend, the faith you point your children toward, the words you have been swallowing for years because you assumed they already knew. None of that dies when you do. Like Joseph's bones, it keeps traveling. It outlives the one who released it. So you do not have to wait for a deathbed to begin. You do not need a dramatic scene or the perfect sentence. The handoff can start tonight with one phone call, one message, one blessing spoken forward into a life that will carry it long after you. So tell me, down in the comments, which of these stayed with you? The crossed hands of a dying father, the bones that kept traveling for 400 years, the song planted so it could outlive the man who wrote it, the arrow shot from a deathbed, or something else entirely. And then picture the oldest of them, an old man in Egypt, far from home, drawing his feet up into the bed for the last time. His hands, which had spent a lifetime grasping and taking, are open now, resting on the heads of his children. He is not saying goodbye. He is letting go of everything except the one thing he means to send on ahead of him. And the blessing leaves his fingers and crosses the room and keeps going into a future he will never see, and it has not stopped moving yet.